Our scripture today is very interesting. You know, when we sign up to preach, most of us don't look ahead at what the scripture is. You just look at your calendar and see when you're free. But I think the next time I sign up to preach, I'm going to look ahead. So today we're presented with the prophet Jeremiah. And we jump into Jeremiah's story at chapter 38. It's like starting a mystery novel in the middle. You know, who are the characters, what's going on? So I went back to the beginning of the book. And these are not happy times in Israel. Half the people in Israel have already left and gone to Babylon. The other half have stayed. And they're not happy that the people went to Babylon. King Zedekiah is upset that if he surrenders to Babylon, the people that went ahead of him are going to kill him when he gets there. And they've been unfaithful to God's work. And so God goes and finds a young man named Jeremiah. I picked out a Jeremiah. And God goes to Jeremiah and says to Jeremiah, I want you to be my prophet, and I want you to go to Israel. And Jeremiah says,
I am too young. I don't know what to say.
And then God says, God touches Jeremiah's lips, and God says, I will put my word in your mouth. He thinks he's getting off easy. I'm going to put my word in your mouth. I am going to give you authority. I'm going to give you authority to build up and authority to tear down. And Jeremiah says, okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeremiah. And you know, Jeremiah says to God, so what do you want me to say? Well, I want you to go out and tell those people I'm angry. They haven't been faithful. They haven't done what I've asked them to do. They haven't kept the law. And so I'm going to punish them. Well, that's a great message, right? But Jeremiah goes out and preaches the message that God gave him to preach. Reluctantly, but Jeremiah does that. And what do they do to Jeremiah in the beginning of the book? They beat him up. They throw him out. And today we just heard they put him in a cistern, empty, and he's sinking into the mud. Can you imagine what else there is in that cistern? Woo! The one set goes to King Zedekiah and says, Jeremiah's not our friend. And that's how he ends up in the cistern. Because Zedekiah is frustrated with the people too and says, go do with them what you want to do. Then the city official, or the official on the court, comes to the king and says, those guys were wrong. They shouldn't have done that. Zedekiah's a prophet from God. So the king says, okay, go and get 3 strong guys and take them out of the cistern. And then what we don't hear today, which is just a section following, is that the king goes up to Jeremiah and says, Jeremiah, will you meet me in private? And Jeremiah says, yeah, I'll meet with you in private. So the king sets up a secret meeting. And the king says to Jeremiah, tell me what God's really telling you. Now we're in chapter 38 of 52. By this time, Jeremiah's caught up. And Jeremiah says, no, I'm not going to tell you because you're going to kill me. Or you're not going to do what I asked you to do. And the king says, no, I promise. I promise I won't kill you. And I won't harm you in any way. So Jeremiah tells him, from God's lips to my ears to you, surrender to the king of Babylon. And Zedekiah says, the people aren't going to be happy with me if I do that. Now, I'm not going to tell you the end of the story. You have to go read the book. Jeremiah was asked to be faithful to the message that God gave Jeremiah. God didn't say to Jeremiah, you have to be successful, because obviously he was not successful. God said to Jeremiah, you need to be faithful to my message. You need to take the prophetic stance in the circumstances of the world. Not back down when the going gets tough. And like Jesus said at the beginning of the gospel, set the world on fire with my word. And that's what Jeremiah did. And it created dissension. It created that dissension that Jesus talks about in the gospel. Didn't create peace. It created dissension. Now, when I look at that piece of the gospel, I thought, okay, Marian, are you going to cower it out and then just preach on Jeremiah and Hebrews and forget the gospel? I wanted to, but God wouldn't let me. So I pondered, and I looked at some resources. You know, Jesus tells us in the scripture, he didn't come to bring peace like the world brings peace. And he's very clear in the gospel. He didn't come to bring peace. I came to bring dissension. Now, why would he say that? He would say that because the gospel message is very hard to hear. The gospel message is very hard to live. And the gospel message of equity and justice is not embraced in open arms by everyone in the world. And certainly not in our times. Not in our times. But you know, church, this isn't the first time we've had dissension in the world and the church. Go back to Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul were arguing, do the Gentiles need to be circumcised, practice the Jewish law, and then they can follow Jesus? So you've got this battle going on. Who are you a follower? Are you a follower of Peter, or are you a follower of Paul? In reality, we're followers of Jesus. Neither of them. Now, some of you are of my age, and you remember the days when the church would not allow interfaith marriages. Dissension. Some of you remember the days, even if it was your daughter or your son, and they got married over in the Baptist church, you could not go if you were going to keep the church rules. You could not go. I remember the days as a child. My parents were not married in the church. Neither of them were married before. The reason was my grandmother, my Italian grandmother, went to confession, had an argument with the priest. He wouldn't give her absolution, so she took the whole family and left the church. Italian grandmother, you know? So my parents weren't married in the church. As a child, I would go up to communion, and I would come back from communion seeing my mother in tears because she was denied Eucharist. Pain and dissension in the church. I can still feel that. Because that's because. So what do we do, church? Because dissension is all around us. Dissension is within our own being. How do we address dissension? I read a clip from you have a resource we use for prayer at the convent called The Word Among Us. And this is what The Word Among Us said. I'm going to read it because it is such a clear message about what to do with dissension. And I'm going to stand over here so I can see both sides at the same time. Division may be inevitable, but it doesn't need to be permanent. Division may be inevitable, but it doesn't need to be permanent. And here's where you come in. Here's where we come in. How will you respond to those divisions when they manifest themselves in your heart, in your home, in your workplace, wherever you may be? How are you going to manage that division? With compassion and prayer and understanding, or defensiveness, arguments, and condemnation? It's in our hands how we manage the division. That the divisions are is not in our hands, but how we respond to division is in our hands. So I'm going to tell a couple stories on myself. When I was a young sister, I was very social justice active. Doesn't surprise you. So my first mission was to people that picked the cotton in the cotton camps. Lived in little shacks with dirt floors, no running water, maybe a light bulb in their house. So they impacted my life. So when Cesar Chavez and Delora Huerta are starting the Farm Workers Union, I'm right behind it all. So we would have a gathering of people from the parish, and there'd be some wine there and appetizers. And United Farm Workers was picketing Gallo Winery. They picked the first big winery, tried to break through to get the union in. And so somebody brought a jug of Gallo wine to the church event. Well, here's Sister Marian. I go up and I pick it up and I say, "Who brought this?" And I say it in a way that nobody's raising their hand. And I take it over to the sink and I dump it out. And if there's two, I go back and get the second one and take it to the sink and I dump it out. Or I'm with a group of people out for dinner and they serve us a salad. And I say to the waiter, "Is that Union lettuce? Did it have an eagle? Did it have an eagle on the thing?" And he goes back and checks and says, "No." So I said, "Well, here's my salad." Now, that's okay. But then I looked at the rest of the people at the table saying, "You're not going to eat that salad, are you?" Now, that was a way to deal with dissension that made more dissension. I had a lot to learn. I think I've learned some of it. I've learned how to be humble. I've learned how to be curious. Mary, or Taylor, you and I don't agree on this. We've come to different conclusions. Can you share with me what's happened in your life that brought you to that point of view? You see the difference? I start a conversation out of curiosity. There is no judgment. Whereas before in my life, I would take a position. I was right and you were wrong. And of course, I was always the one right. God invites us not to take positions. Who's right and who's wrong isn't even the right question. How do we enter into the conversation with compassion and love? So how do we enter into the darkness? Father Samuel gave me a story, and I'm going to steal his story. There's a little boy, and he's afraid of the dark. And he forgot to bring his toys in, so they're in the outside the house by the front door. And he's in his bedroom and said, "Oh, my toys are out in the dark. Mama, go and get my toys for me." And the wise mother said, "No, it's okay. Jesus is out. You know, God will be with you. Go out there." So the little boy opens the door, and the toys are just like beyond his reach, and says, "Jesus, are you out there?" Jesus, are you out there? Jesus is out there with us. And so our invitation is to be faithful like Jeremiah was faithful, whether we're successful or not. Our invitation, church, is to walk our talk. Our invitation is to take the prophetic stance, to allow God to use us to set the world ablaze and on fire, and to do it in a way that manifests God's compassion and love that God has already shown to us. To manifest God's forgiveness that God has already shown to us. To manifest God's lavish, unconditional love that God has already shown to us. For we all stand